Hello, welcome. My name is Laura Davis, and this is a short video lecture on Margaret Laurence's short story called The Rain Child. The Rain Child is from a collection of Margaret Laurence's short stories called The Tomorrow Tamer. This is what it looks like. It is a collection of stories that she wrote about Africa, and when she was, I guess, a younger writer. Her early writing, much of it is about Africa. And she went to both Somalia and Ghana. And the collection of stories called The Tomorrow Tamer, they all take place in Ghana. And this was actually right around the time when the colonialists were pulling out of many African countries, and including the ones she visited. And so a lot of what she writes about is that, and about the kind of collapsing empire. She writes, in her words, as a sympathetic outsider. So she was very much against colonialism and kind of felt empathetic to the local people that she met there. However, she was an outsider, right? Margaret Laurence actually went to Africa as the wife of an engineer who was hired to work for the colonial project. But nevertheless, she was an anti-colonialist, and she was very much against colonialism. So as I said, she writes her stories as a sympathetic outsider. I will say this, so the stories were written late 50s. I think the book was actually published in 1960. So that kind of context is important to keep in mind. Here we have a Canadian writer writing about African countries in the late 50s, early 60s, when the English were pulling out of these countries, and well before things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too and even the civil rights movement hadn't started yet. So just kind of important to keep that context in mind. A lot has happened since 1960. At the same time, in terms of the history of English literature, these stories are still pretty recent. Anything after World War II is considered kind of the postmodern era. So that's kind of a context to keep in mind for The Rain Child. Now, The Rain Child itself is in first-person narration. The narrator is a character named Violet Nedden, who we're introduced to right away, and she begins the story with kind of a description of her surroundings and the setting, right? Violet Nedden, I would say, is kind of closely aligned to the author, to Margaret Laurence herself, in terms of the kind of outlook she had towards colonialism and the kind of sympathy she had for the local people. It is not, however, autobiographical in the true sense of the word. I mean, Laurence was not a school teacher there as Nedden is. But nevertheless, I think there's some alignment between the author and the narrator in terms of their outlook on life. Much of the story is about the idea of being an outsider. So we can see that playing out in a lot of different ways. Violet Nedden herself is an outsider in Africa, right? She's an English school teacher who's come to teach in a colonial school in Ghana and is an outsider there. And yet she also, because she has lived in Africa for some time, she will feel like an outsider when she returns back to England. And even thinking back to England, she knows that she'll be different and that she'll feel like an outsider back in her own homeland too. And indeed, at the end of the story, we have her kind of musing on that the empire is falling, that she will be asked to leave the colonial school, and she will be going back to England, and she thinks about how she will feel like a stranger in England, just as she has been an outsider in Africa. Now, in terms of character, there's some interesting characters in the story. Violet Nedden, I would say, is a character foil to Hilda Povey, who is the headmistress of the school. And Hilda Povey definitely upholds colonial values and sees herself as superior to the locals there and the children that she teaches. Violet Nedden does not. So in terms of their outlooks, they are very different in that regard. One thing too I'll mention is that the story critiques the colonial education system, much like Achebe does in Dead Man's Path. So that's kind of a similarity between the two stories. However, of course, Achebe is writing from more of an insider perspective, whereas Laurence is writing from a white settler outsider perspective. But nevertheless, she critiques the system, and one kind of instance in which she does so, I think it's throughout, but one instance in which she explicitly critiques the colonial system is when she talks about how she's teaching English literature and she's teaching Wordsworth and English literature to these children who have never been to England, may never go to England, and don't have a lot of, it doesn't feel very close to home for them. So instead of teaching them about their own cultures and instead of valuing their own literature and languages, the opposite is being done. And she knows that. She's within the system, and yet she critiques the system and realizes how ridiculous it is when the children, one child brings her some flowers because they had just read about daffodils in Wordsworth's story, and it hits Violet Nedden how silly that colonial enterprise is to teach the colonial culture of which these children, kind of devaluing their own culture by doing so. In terms of character, to go back to character for a minute, I mentioned that Violet Nedden and Hilda Povey are character foils. I would also argue that Ruth Kwanzaa and Ayesha are character foils. So we have these two African children. Ruth Kwanzaa is very much kind of aligned with Violet Nedden in a way. She's her family's from Africa, her parents are from Africa. Technically, Nedden says, this is your culture. And yet, Ruth Kwanzaa has lived in England for most of her life. Her parents are very educated and have worked over there, and she's lived there, and she really feels more a part of the English culture than the African culture, even though her family is originally from Africa and from Ghana. So she feels like an outsider, and I think that Violet Nedden sympathizes with her, and there's an alignment between them in that sense. So in terms of the character foils, Ruth as opposed to Ayesha is a child that is very much embedded within the African culture and not aligned with the English culture as Ruth Kwanzaa is. But this story, as I said, is very much about being an outsider. Ruth Kwanzaa feels like an outsider in what is supposed to be her own culture, but it's not. She really has, the English culture has become her own from having lived there so long. And similarly, Violet Nedden feels like an outsider in Africa, but also when she goes back home, she will be changed and she will be an outsider there. I want to mention about Violet Nedden's discussion of her garden chair. And look in the story the various times that she talks about her garden chair, because she describes it as if it's a kind of throne with her ebony scepter beside her. And I think that she's kind of seeing herself as a queen, in a sense, the English queen, right? She's mocking the empire. She says that her chair, the gold on it is flaking off, it's old, like the empire itself is kind of, it's collapsing, it's dying, right? She herself is getting older. In a sense, she's a representative of empire, and she knows that its time has come. And so she sits in this chair, she knows her privilege, and yet she also mocks it because she doesn't believe in the colonial enterprise, even though she is a part of it. David Mackay is another interesting character in some ways. So he's a white colonialist living in Africa. He's a child. His parents worked there and are colonialists in Ghana. David Mackay strikes up a friendship with Ruth Kwanzaa, and in some ways they have quite a bit in common because they both have English cultures and values. Even though Ruth's originally from Africa and David is originally English, they've both lived in England, they both know the culture, and they kind of bond in that sense. However, David Mackay problematically sees Africa, he kind of objectifies everything African. Interesting to pay attention to those passages where he talks about scientifically looking at animals in the zoo. It's very much a kind of objectifying scientific kind of view that he has, and a Western view that I think Laurence is kind of critiquing, and especially problematic for Ruth when she is aligned with the objects and people and things that are being objectified by somebody like David Mackay. And later in the story, we hear that his parents don't want her to play with him anymore because she is African. So that, of course, is problematic as well, and contributes to the sense of Ruth not being feeling as an outsider in both Africa and in England, where she spent so much of her time. Well, more, I think she's more feels more at home in England, in fact, and less at home in Africa. Okay, just kind of coming to the end, as I said, important to kind of think about the end and how Violet Nandon muses that she will feel like an outsider even when she goes home to what is supposed to be her homeland. And I wanted to bring up a couple comparisons between this story and Achebe's Dead Man's Path. I mentioned already that they both address the English colonial education system and critique it. So that is one thing that they're both doing in their stories. They both include gardens in their stories, so interesting to pay attention to the way those are described. They are described, in some ways I think the gardens are aligned with colonial enterprise and with cultivation, and you can see that outside plants are being brought in to be gardened in both of those stories. Particularly with Hilda Povey's garden in The Rainchild. And as I said, Achebe writes more as an insider to the culture, whereas Laurence explicitly writes as a sympathetic outsider. It's a beautiful story. I have done some critical work on it, so if you're interested in finding more about my interpretation of Margaret Laurence's The Rainchild, you can take a look at my book called Margaret Laurence Writes Africa and Canada. It's available at the library, and there is a section in this book on there's a chapter on the Tomorrow Tamer and then a section on The Rainchild within that chapter. Thank you very much for listening.